So we can look at the pervasive nature of surveillance that extends not only in reference to the state, but corporations at large. It's given rise to a totalizing, orientation towards people. As I say, that you're not a person, you're communicated as a demand center, and so therefore ultimately it's to profile you in reference to what you can do. But what is coupled with that is the potential of what you could do that would be beyond their profiling. This is the threat they want to trace. If you look at, say, the question of security, which is always what authoritarian regimes tend to kind of focus on, that's in reference to a totalizing risk that we absolve ourselves of. So I always talk about that a buyer's journey is given as a risk-free proposition because you don't question your existential status when you're given as a demand center. And so when you practice existential arbitrage, that's considered a risk-free trade because the risk is obviously predicated upon the agency that you don't demonstrate. So you can only risk if you create beyond the self that is sanctioned in the paradigm. And so because you don't do that, then that's the risk-free. The only thing that you can risk is your envisaging or the way how you invest in the marginality of your time. And so ultimately what you allow to mediate your preoccupation with the way how that you envisage your life to be. So that's obviously subordinate to a risk that we totally externalize. But the way how risk is framed from a surveillance state is not in reference to that, because that's like, you've got to think that these people are completely fucking oblivious to the nature of questions of spirituality. But you can look at it in a way that total paranoid machine is ultimately seeking to quantify and to manage and to look at anything that would be aberrant or would be a signal of a divergence, we could say. And the divergence is in reference to what you do, and so therefore the question that drives your actions, which is ultimately a spiritual question. And this is the way how we can frame it in reference to a question that is completely discounted. And so the way how our whole entire apparatus gets blindsided. And so the way that you can look at this is through, and we're getting a glimpse of this through the way how that you look at, say, you've got AI, you've got, say, crypto or stable coins or the whole, crypto kind of space, and the question of credit. So questioning the legitimacy of credit that relates to, whether or not it's the US dollar or any kind of form of credit, you're looking at something that would surpass a failing paradigm, but then ultimately you're not looking at the question of credit that relates to your existential status when, the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey is given in order for people to question the credit in the first place. And so this is why the risk when you're looking at total surveillance is in reference to the aberrant spirituality that would then invalidate credit as a means of exchange. All right? And then we can connect that to the whole fascistic kind of paradigm is ultimately in reference to the democratization of creativity when you create beyond your own redundancy or the principal product that you're given as, because that's ultimately what totalizes the risk in a way that these people cannot deal with. So money is the primary tool for the way how that we mediate ourselves. And so, ultimately if we legitimize our actions as money making, ultimately we don't make money. We legitimize the use of a credit we are not the originator of, that allows parasitism as a value add to the buyer's journey set. So people can sit there as a pastime and indulge in conspiracy theories and whatnot to absolve themselves of responsibility that they do it to themselves. In order to transcend or to no longer legitimize the use of a credit people are not the originators of, is to obviously delegitimize the proxy for the goodwill that we would direct and that would animate say our lives beyond the totalizing claim of the buyer's journey. And so that's the way how if we did do that, it allows us to create a commonality with other people given in the same way, where our trusts would be direct. you can understand in this way, people talk about low trust societies. So when you have a diverse, or you've got all these different people from different walks of life, and they don't share common, common values, you can frame this out and look at, well, everybody shares the same value, when they presuppose time is a value or something that's marginal. And so if you only look at, say, low trust societies in reference to, say, people coming in, but then you don't look at, well, let's step back from that and look at it prior. Well, you used money as a tool for thinking prior to, say, let's say any of these things. So even when, say, European countries or Western countries were considerably a lot more homogeneous, as it were, the nature of the trust that you had, there might obviously have been more, but then you've got to look at the way how that money was used to mediate trust, because obviously you did not demonstrate goodwill, obviously, because goodwill in that context is usurped through the way how that, by using money, that you conceal the question of it. And so we could say that the issue of low trust societies is ultimately dealing with the question of trust, all right, but in reference to goodwill that money, the use of money conceals. And so this is a way that you can connect it to, looking at the aberrant spirituality that would change, that would invalidate credit as a means of exchange. Because if you are demonstrating, say, goodwill or acting directly on the world, that's the trust that you would share with other people. That's the common bond that you would share when you're creating a common ethos of a people. And if you're creating a common ethos beyond the way that you would mediate your actions as money making, you're creating a cultural legacy that you hand down. So you can always read what's occurring, say now, but in a slightly different way to get a broader perspective on it, that relates to ultimately the way how people don't actually address these things. And so, because if you act directly on the world, so you are effectuating a change on the self, but in turn through the way how you're orientated towards place, by no longer mediating in yourself, you delegitimize obviously parasitism or the managerial caste as a principle. Because if this managerial part, if you've got bankers that administer the credit and marketers that manage our desires as conjurers of it, and politicians that ultimately regulate, say, markets that ultimately, or regulate access to certain domains through licensing or whatnot, and then you have technocrats that optimize the system in reference to your redundancy. This whole grouping is given in reference to the democratization of creativity, or the way how that if you acted upon the world to animate a creativity that you're not credited when you're given it as a demand center, then you're creating a world beyond obviously these people. And so therefore you can then read the whole apparatus of capture is based upon that. So it is ultimately inherently, it will thwart, it's ultimately seeking, if you think of the way how, say, maybe popularism gets demonized, but then you look at a popular movement that relates to the question of spirituality and the way how you democratize creativity. So if you're democratizing creativity, then you're not given as passive or as demand center. If you are creating, or your actions are being animated no longer by legitimizing use of a credit you are not the originator of, but the way how that you animate, or that you say originate a credit that gets annulled. And so the way how that the credit, the question of credit changes from the ownership of credit to the credit of ownership, well, that obviously shifts beyond obviously these people. But the surveillance is in reference, maybe we could say, to what is a potential for change. And so therefore you just need total surveillance in order to ensure that if there's any kind of blip on the screen, then it has to be, it's giving a sign of a potential of something. And so that's why if the no ones are the ones that create the world and people work in concert in that way, it's coming from all these different, say, agents. And so therefore you can't really kind of trace it, because it's not, you cannot appropriate what would be a movement when people question beyond their own captivation. because then it becomes a spiritual renewal, and ultimately the spiritual renewal is only as good as the actions that renewal animates. So when so in that term, what you do is that you have you could say there's an unmediated force that is direct upon the world, because if you're not predicating your actions for a return, so seeking a compensation for being born, but your spirituality animates what is without origination, so the perennial genesis of what would be put into play when you create beyond the self that you're otherwise sold on, that is through the animation of individual turns people take. And so therefore the creation is beyond the individual act, and it's the way how that they say these acts that turn are ultimately animating a dynamism, a cultural dynamism beyond our own captivation. There's no need for anybody to mediate one's desire or to contour it towards an end that a person does not hold out for themselves. And so that in that way, that direct uncompensated act of creation creates the necessary mutual goodwill of a civilizational domain that people own. All right, and so through their ownership of a civilizational domain, that changes the nature of the credit. And so the more that people do that, the more that they delegitimize the mediation when you predicate your actions as money making, because ultimately what it does, it invalidates credit as a means of exchange. Like I said, it goes, and this is where you can use distributed ledger technology beyond the way how it's otherwise envisaged. If, say, distributed ledger technology is in reference to the issues of banking, and you talk about the way how that you've got, it deals with questions of, say, trust, or trustlessness. Well, you have to embody trust. So even if you presuppose the architecture for trust, and so therefore you don't need an intermediary to ensure that the payment will be received and vice versa, and you don't need that clearing, say, house. The clearing is literally through people's actions, and so the way how that they create a legacy that they own and that they share. All right, and so therefore it becomes direct, and in turn that question of the way how trustlessness works. Well, trustlessness works in the sense of embodying a spirit that pervades, or in the sense that's shared amongst people. And so that's why, so if you're looking at it from demonizing people, so you work back to, like, say, I suppose if you talk from Western, say, countries and the way how that they discount the native populations. And so, if people are there and they're talking about, say, mass migration or the weaponization of migration, well, you discount people in order to, because the whole economic model is based upon growth. So you got to kick the can down a road, and this is a way to achieve it. So ultimately you delegitimize these people or populist movements. But if that populist movement was not in reference to politics, so the way it gets beholden to your replacement, but then ultimately, as I always say, you've got to understand the way how you produce yourself as the economic agent that you're given as, or that demand center, in order for you to be replaceable in the first place. So that means to say that that form of popularism obviously has its orientation towards the democratization of creativity, which then would obviously give context to any populist movement yet to actually question people's existential status. So you can say that you demonize that, but if people keep on following these questions, so, and they can find different avenues to achieve it. So as I always say, you can front run this from what we just talked about the way how that you use money. So the question of credit when it relates to different forms of credit, or say the failing paradigm of fiat currency in reference to crypto or Bitcoin. But then you can go beyond that and understand the way how it's that you're given as a demand center or as a credit instrument. Or you could look at it from the nature of the way how you produce yourself in order for you to be replaced from AI or from people that are come in from outside your country. That also relates to the way how that you are ensuring that the question that the native population, especially in Western countries, they're the ones that have dealt with modernity the longest. So there's most potential for a renaissance in these countries, because they once they understand the nature of the spiritual disease, then ultimately what it would do is it would potentialize an action beyond their own captivation. That means to say that surveillance, that's why surveillance, I mean, not to say that it's not the same surveillance within the paranoid state maybe of, say, China or any other country, but you can see why that is important for the West, and particularly because, like as I said, there's the most potential for change within Western civilization, being the most dynamic civilizational domain on the planet. And so therefore you can see the Arthurian turn in reference to the latent potential there. And so the all-seeing eye, that panopticon that Foucault talked about, or the eye of Horus on the top of the pyramid, it is a paranoid's eye. It's a eye of constant paranoia, because anything that is aberrant, and this is where the nature of aberrance, if it's not connected in a data point, obviously potentializes what is latent, where it can arise in different areas. And so one of the things when you're looking at what we talk about, to potentialize the question of people's spirituality or the way how they produce themselves, I always talk about this. If you don't have a conversation with people about this, you doing that potentializes the conversation in reference to their people's existential status. You force them to question outside their bounds, and so therefore creates the potential for what would be a civilizational renewal. So if you don't see that conversation laterally, as it were, then ultimately none of this will occur. That's why it's a prerequisite, is that because then you cannot, if you look at surveillance now and the way they're trying to manage narratives, you can't control the narrative when it relates to the principal product that you're given out. There's no way that you can do that. There's no way that you can influence the way how people would think about that. And I always, the way I frame political propaganda is ultimately, or censorship is ultimately in reference to that, but it's literally an impossibility, because once that conversation gets seeded and it occurs, like in the civilizational domain of the West predominantly, then it will occur in different nation states. And so it potentializes the actions within countries to reinvigorate the nation in reference to the commonality that is shared outside the borders of those countries. When you have that occur, then what you've got is you've got the potential for change to occur in different regions, where it regions the different spirituality. And there's nothing you literally can do beyond that once that starts to occur. Anyway.